G'day Justin, how are you?
I'm well, Nick. How are you?
Excellent, really well, thank you. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining us. Not everybody's going to know who you are, and so I thought we'd just start by talking a little bit about who is Justin Nix.
Good question. I'm CEO of Guardian Living, and which is a great privilege. I'm very passionate about accessible housing and always have been. So the opportunity to lead an organisation that's delivering accessible housing is just wonderful, and I've got a great team of people around me.
Yeah, great. So you grew up, if I go back one step, you grew up in Melbourne, born and raised Melbourne, or Victorian at least?
Western suburbs.
Yeah.
So in the early stages I grew up in the Essendon area, hence my love of the Essendon Football Club, but we're not here to talk about football.
Well.
So I grew up in the Essendon area in Keilor Park, Niddrie, later in Diggers Rest. So yeah, those western suburbs.
Well, I'm Hawthorn, so I think maybe we could just divert a little bit into football, but maybe we'll stay on target. So growing up in Essendon, and you've ended up being passionate about housing and especially disability, housing for people with disabilities and special needs. How did that come about? Where's the transition there?
Yeah, it was interesting. As a kid, I only ever wanted to work in the building industry, and so I wanted to be a carpenter and a builder, and I wanted to build. That's all I ever wanted to do. So that's what I set about doing after I left high school, but it became really obvious to me that I've actually got a mild disability myself and a genetic condition. And despite being so passionate about wanting to do carpentry and building, it was obvious to me that that wasn't sustainable for me from a health perspective and physical perspective. So I did carpentry, I studied building, and I did most of the subjects to become a qualified building surveyor. But I was forced to look at things differently, and in hindsight that was a wonderful opportunity for me, because instead of working on the tools, I ended up doing construction management and project supervision, and ultimately becoming an access consultant, which has been incredibly rewarding. And what led me to becoming an access consultant was having a couple of friends with disabilities, and one in a wheelchair, and just going out to socialise with them, seeing firsthand the discrimination that they experienced in the built environment about not being able to access public places. And I thought, wow, this is just not right. It's really bad. And then so the opportunity to join the two together to combine building skills and knowledge and qualifications with doing home modifications and looking at the built environment from an access point of view and advising organisations how to deliver better buildings and environments was that was the opportunity for me.
Yeah, I love that. So when was that roughly?
So yeah, we're talking about the late 80s, the early 90s. So I did go on to study building, and I held the qualification of commercial builder with unlimited registration, but my interest was more in doing access consultancy work and working through doing access audits and advising organisations about how they could make change and be more inclusive, and how that translates to better business and just less discrimination. And back in the late 80s, it was bad. We're getting better at it. We're still not wonderful at it. And now we have the Disability Discrimination Act, and we have better building codes that force people to do it. But people need to understand the benefits of universal design and good access.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, because 30 odd years have passed since then, and that's why I was interested to know when and in that time, the changes that you've seen, has it been significant, or do you think there's still a lot of work to be done?
It has been significant, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Yeah, so I mean, the Disability Discrimination Act is a complaints-based legislation. So, it's unfortunate that it gets to a complaint situation to initiate change. And so the building code's changed, and now it's the building code ensures compliance of the built environment, but compliance isn't necessarily the best outcome. What we need to understand is good universal design and those principles. There's a lot of common sense there, and if universal design principles are applied to the way we think, the way we design, it's not just limited to buildings, it's processes, it's products. There's a lot of just really good common sense when you apply universal design.
Yeah, universal design's interesting to me because I go back probably pre-COVID. COVID was a thing, wasn't it, sometime? But the universal design seemed to have a lot of energy. There was a lot of people talking about universal design. That doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. I'm not hearing that same thing. Is that fair to say, or what's happening in the space of universal design?
Yeah, so isn't COVID fascinating to look back on? Like what COVID taught us is that we can be adaptable and flexible and all those buzzwords, we can pivot and we can make things happen with, great adversity. Like in the context of the NDIS and people with disabilities, we were able to discharge people out of hospital to safer and better environments. And we made all this happen. And we were incredibly flexible. And now I feel like we've gone back the other way, back to that bureaucratic way of thinking and putting process in the way. And it's interesting. But getting back to universal design, we work in a world, and this is beyond SDA, I feel. We work in a very prescriptive world. We're told how to do it and what to do, particularly when we look at building regulations, and more specifically compliance for specialist disability accommodation. It's so prescriptive, and there's advantages to that, but there's a lot of disadvantages as well.
Right. Particularly
for a person that might have bariatric requirements. When the standard says that the toilet pan needs to be 450 to 460 millimetres from a side wall, and that doesn't suit you as a user, that's a really bad outcome. Yeah, so not one size fits all. That's right, and that's kind of going against universal design and those principles.
Yeah,
to be able to be flexible, adaptable, intuition and all of that.
Gee, that's an interesting conundrum, isn't it? Because what do you do then if not one size fits all? Are we fighting a lost war? Is there some middle ground here that really does work?
I don't want to say we're fighting a lost war, because we should never give up. But what we need is government and agencies to think a little bit differently, to not be so prescriptive. Like the building regulations actually have a performance solution approach where this is the prescriptive objective of what you're trying to achieve when you design a building, and there's a deemed to satisfy way of achieving that outcome. However, there's alternative solutions to meet the same outcome, and that's what we don't have in the world of SDA. Yeah, okay. So I do want to talk a little bit about SDA, but just again for context, you're the CEO of Guardian Living, have been now for? About 4 years.
4 years. Can you tell us a little bit about Guardian Living then?
Sure. Guardian Living, I feel that the best way to describe us is we manage stakeholders to deliver good housing for people who need it. And the reason why I say we manage stakeholders is we take a very holistic approach to delivering accessible housing. So it's not a process where you can start at the start and you achieve an outcome of handing over the keys to an SDA dwelling and a person with a disability moves in. It's an approach that looks at an outcome very holistically beyond post-occupancy. Okay, so what we do is we work with capital partners and one major capital partner in particular and we work with people with disabilities, we work with architects and builders, and we're kind of a developer of SDA, but it goes beyond the development approach. So at the end of it, you know, when a person with a disability moves into one of our SDA dwellings, we continue to stay involved, because what we've learned and what we need to understand is to deliver not just good practice but best practice SDA, you need to continually extract learnings from what you do. You need to continue to have some oversight on the way that that person is receiving their supports, and you know, SIL, supported independent living, is integrated into an SDA dwelling or a project, and then, you know, ultimately if someone moves out, or you know, we need to understand why they're moving out, and a lot of the times it's just because we all do that, you know, circumstances in life change and it's time to move on. But if a person's not happy with a particular feature of their SDA, for example, we want to understand that. So it takes that very holistic approach to do it well.
So whose responsibility is that? So you're taking a very proactive approach as an SDA developer, but as you say, you're a lot more than just the developer, because you take a long-term approach. Is that right? Is that the model that all SDA developers should be taking, or does that really fall to somebody else?
It's a good question, and now is the time for all of us to sit back and reevaluate how we do it, and not why it. I mean, that's obvious why we do it, but where, how, and when, because you know, we've just had a significant price review, which we can talk about later. So now's the time to look back on the last 7 years and say, well, are we going about this the right way? And we're always doing that, obviously, that's just good business practice. But I think in the SDA sector, now's the time to do that, and we need to do things differently. So that's the approach that we take, and many great SDA providers do take, because of the advantages of doing it that way. So from the investor's point of view, what their objective is to invest in high quality housing and not have any vacancy or limited vacancy, because otherwise they're not getting the return that they would hope to get. So only by taking a holistic approach can you mitigate that as much as you can. So, you know, we want to understand that our tenants are happy living where they are, work out how we can, you know, better support them, how we can change the design in the next project we do, and even from the support provider's perspective, about how we can better integrate support into that built environment to get those outcomes. And it's complex. It's a really hard sector to work in.
Yeah, I can see that. And there's a lot of moving parts.
It's huge. And so getting back to like stakeholder management, that's what we do. Because you can't just sit back and say, our job as an SDA provider or developer is simply to design a building, get it certified, and hand over the keys. It doesn't work like that.
Well, you can't shoehorn people with unique needs into square pegs, round holes, right?
That's right. That's right. But interestingly, that's what the SDA framework does to some extent.
But as we said before, how do you, how broad a brush do you use, and how do you encompass everybody with such a huge range of different needs, physically, mentally, all of these things?
Absolutely, particularly in the area of robust SDA, which we can talk about later.
I'd love to talk. So SDA, Specialist Disability Accommodation, is administered by the NDIA under the NDIS scheme. So there's lots of words and letters around all of that. So NDIA is the administration, NDIS is the scheme, as I understand it, and SDA sits within the NDIS and administered by the NDIA. So is it working?
That's a very complex question. So let's start at a very high level. It depends which stakeholder you talk to, okay? And we've seen some wonderful examples of SDA, and we've seen some really poor examples. Okay, so is it working? I feel like it is working, and it's starting to work better for many reasons. So if we talk to an SDA eligible participant who's moved into an SDA dwelling, for many of those people it's life-changing. So it's working incredibly well. It is literally, enabled them to be more independent, to be happier, to get out into the community. It's been remarkable. So at that level, absolutely it's working. If you talk to investors or support providers or families or planners, they might have a different perspective. So we've seen the good and the bad.
Every industry has that.
Yeah, of course.
It's just unfortunate that in this industry we're talking about people that have got either a disability or significant challenge in their life, much more than touch wood you or I will ever have.
Yep.
And how do you balance a commercial reality with a human outcome?
Yep, that's right. So let's just talk a little bit about what the government is expecting from the sector. Okay, so SDA is a market-driven approach. So instead of state governments investing in disability housing like they used to do, and it's important to understand that support was attached to that housing in the old world before the NDIS. So someone with a disability living in a group home, if they weren't happy with the support that they were receiving, the only option they had was to move out of that house. And there were rarely suitable options available for that
into
person.
probably another group home.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're in this world now where the agency, the NDIS, have separated housing and support, and that's a great concept. Okay, but with SDA, what the federal government is asking us, the market, to do is to invest sometimes millions of dollars for one project, borrow the money, take on development risk, work with developers and builders and architects, design and build and invest with no guarantee of any return. Okay, so the pricing for SDA is attached to the participant who may or may not be eligible under the NDIS rules and the Act.
Right.
Okay, so as a sector, what we're taking a huge risk, and investors are, to hopefully deliver a great product which will attract the demand and activate a return. And large scale or capital partners who are looking to invest in SDA at scale, it's a challenge to achieve that scale.
Yeah.
Okay, so what our sector is heavily reliant on is good market stewardship from government and the agency. We're very vulnerable to changes in policy, to changes in patterns of who's getting approved and for what. Very, very vulnerable. So we need great market stewardship. And I feel that over the past 7 years, we've had good examples of market stewardship and we've had bad examples. Okay, so I feel that I'm quite optimistic about the future because I feel that we're just entering a period of good market stewardship again, which has been coming off the back of the recent price review. So I feel good about the future, but we're very, very vulnerable in this sector to changes in thinking by government.
So when you say market stewardship, are you referring directly to government?
Yeah. So I'm referring to the agency in particular, who have the governance and the courage of trying to ensure that there's an appropriate supply of new SDA which meets demand. And ultimately we in the sector are taking on that responsibility. So what we crave and what we need is data, for example. Okay, and what we don't want is changes in policy, and so what we want to see is consistency, and we need to understand that demand to deliver good housing. So we want to understand how many people with SDA are being approved, how quickly are they being approved, what design categories are they being approved, and that's where the market stewardship comes in from the agency, in supporting the market to achieve those outcomes. Because without that, confidence in the market is gone, and investors walk away, and that's not what we want or need, obviously.
Yeah. Is it difficult for the participants to, because I'd imagine if I want to move house, I go shopping, whether I'm renting or I'm going to buy something, I go and look in an area that I want to live, and I choose a place that I think I want to live in. But these guys are kind of, again, funneled into a place where somebody has thought, I think there's a need in this area. And I guess this is what you mean by the data, is that Essendon, let's talk about Essendon. Someone wants to go and build a SDA apartment or apartments in Essendon. What's to say somebody actually who's an SDA approved participant wants to live in Essendon? Is that an issue? How do you, it almost seems a little bit backwards to me sometimes in the way that the system works, because they don't get approved until they find the place. But normally you go, well, go and find a provider, you have approval, you're an approved SDA participant, go and find a provider who's prepared to build what you need in the area you want to live.
Yeah, no, it's a great observation. So let's, to put this in perspective, we're dealing with about 6% of NDIS participants who are actually eligible for SDA. So let's never forget about the other 94%. And a lot of those people have intellectual disability or ageing parents who still have a housing need, but they're not eligible for SDA. Okay, so we'll put that aside for 1 minute. In an ideal world, the agency would assess everyone and give them SDA approval and empower those people to understand what their home and living options are. And then those people and their families would go out into the marketplace and look at what options are out there, and they might get on a website and see Guardian Living building some apartments at Essendon that'll be finished in a couple of months, and they might decide that's where I want to live, and so I'm going to engage with Guardian Living, or they might engage with another provider. That's the ideal world, because in that scenario we can better understand the real demand. Okay, so when we talk about supply and demand, we talk about, well, the way I think about it is hypothetical demand versus actual demand. So actual demand is what SDA approval is in a participant's plan. Okay, so they're empowered to understand that the agency have approved me to go and live in an apartment on my own, and I can use that funding to access the market. Hypothetical demand is what we understand by talking to people with disabilities about what they want and their families and where they want to live and how they want to live. Now that can be incredibly different to actual demand. So they might have a goal of living in an apartment at Essendon on their own, but they end up with an SDA approval of a shared house. So right. in that scenario, what the agency is saying is, well, your approval is for a house, 3 residents maybe, and so there's a disconnect there, okay? And there's all sorts of reasons for that. Perhaps there wasn't adequate clinical justification to support that goal of wanting to live independently, and sometimes we look at a person's circumstances and we don't understand it either. Okay.
What would that look like? Where somebody who has a desire to live independently, but are told, what would be the mechanics that would make a decision or prompt a decision that says, no, you need to live with 2 or 3 other people?
It's a good question. If you're a little bit cynical, you might say that in some cases the agency look at it and say, that they're trying to save a little bit of money.
Yeah.
Because the funding level for a shared dwelling, for example, is significantly less than a one resident approval. Okay, so perhaps there's a little bit of thinking of, we're saving a little bit of money, and we'll come back to that because there's a big problem there.
Right.
But in other cases it might be because there was just inadequate justification from the clinical team that support that person, and perhaps the panel making that decision just didn't have the evidence to support that goal, and so this is what we observe as a provider in the marketplace. Okay, we engage with people who we understand that are SDA eligible because we're pretty good at understanding that cohort. We believe we've got a lot of experience there, but it's frustrating when you engage with a family or a support coordinator and the person with a disability, in some cases for 6 or 12 months, working towards getting them an outcome of getting them approved and supporting them, and then that outcome comes and it's not aligned with what they want or need. That's incredibly frustrating. And it's frustrating for us as a provider, but think about that, the individual, the person with a disability, it's heartbreaking sometimes.
I'm frustrated by it just listening to it. If I want to live somewhere, I don't know. Again, they're in a system, aren't they? They're in a government-funded system, and how do you balance all of that up? But I just feel like we've evolved surely past the point where we need to put people in a box. The old group homes, and I remember attending it was an SDA conference, I think one of the first ones very early on, and I'm sure you were there, but they spoke a lot about the reasons and the motivation behind SDA was to get people out of these group homes, to get young people out of hospitals. I remember them talking a lot about that. So, and yet then we're saying, no, now we're going to approve you to live in a glorified group home. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and so this comes back to market stewardship, doesn't it? So when we observe these things in the sector, what we need to understand is, well, why did that person get that outcome, so that we can get better at it and support those people. Okay, and what we want is transparency, because without that, the sector loses confidence, investors lose confidence. We get higher levels of vacancy, and that's not good for anyone, obviously. So that becomes a frustration, and I get back to my point of looking at this very holistically, and that's what we do, and that's what good providers do, because you have to. And it's incredibly challenging. And again, this market-driven response where we're taking on this responsibility of delivering a pipeline of new housing. Well, what we need is confidence, we need transparency, and we need to understand demand.
Because it sounds to me like you're operating on a level of ethics that maybe not everybody's operating on. Because you say, well, we have to. I think you have to, by the sounds of things to me, because that's the value set of Guardian Living and how you operate. But what a tragedy if you end up in a place where, and I guess I'm talking generally here, but people end up in a place where they're working with a partner like a Guardian Living, unlike a Guardian Living, that don't have that level of values, that level of ethics.
Yeah, that's right. And so what makes me angry and is reading and seeing spruiking and advertisements or spruiking returns of 18%. It's rubbish. If it's seems if it seems too good to be true, it is too good to be true, and that's just not realistic, and that does a lot of damage to our sector. When the public reads that, you work in the world of SDA and you're making all these huge returns, it's just not true. It's doesn't happen.
So so if I play devil's advocate for a little bit, because I remember reading the pricing guideline, I want to talk a bit about that, because my understanding is that the NDIA did a pricing review over from 22-23, August to May, I think it was this year,
Yep.
and then those changes took effect as of the 1st of July this year, is my understanding. I remember reading the very first lot of pricing, and I looked at it thinking, these numbers are amazing. I mean, we were talking about rent in the order of $100,000 a year for a single occupant with an overnight carer. I mean, that sounds like a lot of money, but you're saying it's not enough.
Well, I'm saying it's probably adequate under the right circumstances. Okay,
Right.
so let's reflect on the last 7 years of the SDA journey. What we saw, what the data told us, is there was a very high level of high physical support apartments being delivered in the marketplace, and there was a reason for that. It's because of that income and that return that you were referring to, and so that attracted providers and investors to that part of the matrix. When I talk about the matrix, that's the pricing table that looks at different building types, design categories, the number of residents, and there was an attraction towards apartments. Now that wasn't a bad thing, because SDA apartments delivered really well in clusters. We know through experience and learnings that those models of housing and support work really well. Okay, so we need to learn and reflect on what's been delivered and the quality of SDA that's been delivered, and that all gives us a lot of insights. Okay, so when we look at returns for SDA, when you mentioned that $100,000 and I'm in, where do I invest? What everyone needs to understand is, and what the government need to do is look at this from an actuarial perspective. Okay, $100,000 a year for an apartment's a lot of money, but it costs a lot of money to deliver a good SDA apartment. Okay, but we need to think more broadly than that. Okay, SDA payments are, I'm going to say, they're a drop in the ocean compared to the overall liabilities associated with the NDIS and the scheme. Okay, so from a compensable insurer's perspective, and the Transport Accident Commission were very, very good at doing this, and they are very good at doing this, is looking at the cost of the scheme over the life of the participants that are within that scheme. So housing payments, SDA payments, are only a very small component of that. Okay, we would all be better off if there was greater commitment and spending to SDA, because investment in housing is ultimately helping reduce longer term liabilities associated with supporting people. Okay, so support is the biggest, it's the biggest component of the NDIS. So, when we think about SDA payments, we need to think not just about, well, what's the value of SDA payments? We need to think about that differently as to, what's the potential when you invest in SDA? So from a government perspective, they should be approving more people and spending more money on SDA, because good models of housing and support enable, people with very high support needs to reduce the cost of support. And so that needs to be the thinking. As I said, TAC are very good at this, and they've got a lot of experience. And I feel that sometimes when either the agency or government or investors or people think about SDA, they're so focused on SDA return, but we need to look at the bigger picture, because that's the potential that's not being realised. So, when don't think about the $100,000 SDA payment for one person living in an apartment, think about, well, how is that investment enabling that person to be more independent, and how is it reducing their longer term support? That's the opportunity.
Cause or cure.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yep. So we spoke about the pricing review. What does that meant for Guardian Living, but then I guess, you know, the SDA industry and stakeholders more globally. What were some of the changes, and how has it affected things positively or negatively?
It's been wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah, so credit to Dr. David Cullen, who oversaw the price review. David did an outstanding job, and the agency listened to our concerns, and they got it pretty right. You know, it's not perfect, and it never will be. And there's some huge challenges there that, such as addressing thin markets in SDA. You know, there could have been some better outcomes with helping to address thin markets and looking at the reasons why there's an insufficient supply or pipeline of housing in those thin markets, and a bit of an opportunity lost there, but generally it was a good outcome. So this price review was a 5-year commitment to a major price review of SDA funding, and the outcome of the price review has seen some pricing decrease. So, you know, get back to high physical support apartments, the new pricing is actually, there's been a reduction in that income. And the agency say, well, in hindsight, we probably got it wrong. That the pricing for those high physical support apartments was a little bit too high.
It's too high, right.
Yeah, and that's why we saw, you know, a significant supply of apartments. And what we've seen is a compression of pricing. So what we had previously was a huge gap between improved livability, the lowest level of SDA funding, and high physical support. So we're talking in some cases $35,000 for improved livability up to $115,000 for high physical support.
Right.
And what the price review has done is compress that pricing. So in some cases, improved livability funding has increased by 160%.
Wow.
Which is mind-blowing. It's an enormous uplift. And you know, I would challenge anyone to look at pricing in the disability sector or whatever sector, and to see a government lift a price by 160% is an extraordinary outcome. But it was clever and it was needed, because we would get a lot of people come to us with SDA approval that had improved livability funding and say, what housing options, well, what SDA can you offer us? And we would have to say, well, unfortunately at this stage we can't offer you anything.
Right.
Because, I mean, there was an obvious problem there, that level of funding was insufficient for the market to deliver that product. I mean, have a look at what's happened in the building industry over the past 5 years and land prices. You know, we were dealing with SDA pricing assumptions that were made, you know, 7 to 10 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there was a big problem there, which the agency have fixed to their credit. So what we're able to do now is that cohort of people that were coming to us with improved livability approval, for example, have a much greater allocation of funding in their plan for providers like us to make an offer, and you know, that helps us mitigate vacancy risk, because we can accept and accommodate those people now where previously we couldn't. So the way the sector looks at SDA approvals now is quite different. So we look at SDA outcomes as more of a budget in someone's plan and not an approval level.
Right.
So, you know, someone comes to us and says, I've been approved for SDA, I've got a budget of whatever it is, $70,000.
Yep.
And that now enables us to work with that person to either deliver a housing outcome for them or to make them an offer on a dwelling that we have that's vacant. So that's been a wonderful outcome.
That's really encouraging to hear, because we don't often get the praise of government agencies for getting it right like that, but it sounds like they've done a wonderful job.
Yeah, they have. I mean, the challenges that we still have and what the pricing hasn't fixed is inner city suburban locations. So it's incredibly difficult, almost impossible for us as a provider to purchase a block of land or a house in an inner suburban